Welcome back to The Next Revolution. So you heard our guest, John Pudner, talk about the need for campaign finance reform. We're back with the panel. This whole area of campaign finance reform has been seen as something that the left is more interested in. What do you think of John's crusade to make it something conservatives should get behind?
Yeah, look, I mean, I support it. I think that there is way too much money in politics. I think the biggest problem is that it's making people feel like their voices don't matter. And so they're largely retreating from the public square. They're not, voter turnout numbers have been decreasing. People aren't getting engaged. And so I think that's part of the solution. I don't think it's the entire solution. What I'm actually really excited about is the power of the internet and sort of new mediums and channels that are helping people to have more choice, more voice, more freedom. I think we're seeing a huge increase in uptick in activism. Unfortunately, it's all happening with resistance groups. So folks on the left who are resisting.
You're the resistance.
Resistance groups that are trying to impede Trump's agenda. That happens, though, with the party that's out of power. But I think that's where I think we're going to see some changes.
What do you think of this tax credit idea?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's interesting. I think it encourages people. I mean, I think we should be doing anything that we can to get people.
And the thing you're giving amplifies it, because the fact that we were buying 2-cent commercials against Eric Cantor one of the last campaigns I did, it was affordable to win a race. We couldn't afford network TV. So everything you're saying is true. It also makes that $100 donation that much more important.
Exactly.
Look, I think there's some really interesting experiments happening at a state level. I mean, we've seen it in Maine, we've seen it in Seattle. I mean, there are really, really interesting things happening. My question to you is, well, there's this program, Democracy Dollars, happening in Seattle, where essentially if you're a citizen, you can get a check in the mail, which you can give to any citizen, and if you're a candidate, you can participate in that program. Pretty powerful concept. My question to you is, can it scale nationwide, and how do we get it from a state level to a federal level to actually influence a presidential campaign?
Absolutely, and it's a balancing. It's keeping bad money out and getting this good money in, but South Dakota, perfect example. We were just involved in a referendum last year that brought in these small dollar incentives, but it also stopped the practice of unlimited and undisclosed gifts and contributions. That's the South Dakota law. It's absurd. So you're right. We have 50 states to experiment in. I think these things are going to work, but we've got to keep bad money out as well.
I love it. So you got very excited about democracy dollars.
Yeah, no,
not in a good way.
I'm excited because it's being legally challenged by the Pacific Legal Foundation, and they'll probably win because there are clearly First Amendment violations happening in Seattle right now, and this is an idea that's been floated for decades, voting with dollars, and somehow leveling the playing field, which never really happens because although you've got wonderful intentions, and it's certainly refreshing to see something happening from a different side. The reason that there are so many progressives who were upset with the Citizens United decision, the Supreme Court decision, was because it allowed for free flow of money into elections. They only wanted unions to be able, and nonprofits to control elections, and unions are just as corrupt as some of these cronyist relationships that we'll talk about a little later on. But also, I happen to agree in the McCutcheon case, the Supreme Court decision, Clarence Thomas actually agreed with the majority opinion. That was McCutcheon versus the Federal Elections Commission, and it was one of those voting cases where Justice Thomas said that all limits on contributions are a violation of the First Amendment. And I guess the ultimate conclusion here is corrupt government doesn't require more government, and that's what it's seeking, and that is a flawed premise.
Well, I don't want to speak for you, John, but I think I know the answer to that. You go first.
Well, we've got to keep some bad money out, though, and I do agree with your worldview on Seattle, by the way. Yeah. But on the limits,
just very quickly, because I know you're going to make a good point here. There are two cases, and you actually brought up Eric Cantor, Dave Bratt, and President Trump, two people who overcame Goliaths with a lot less money. And the prevailing wisdom on election night was that Hillary Clinton was going to win because she had $1 billion, and it goes to the sophistication of voters who may not vote, but they are more engaged, and they are finding non-traditional means of getting information.
2 months out, I sent an email to the whole world saying Trump wins, loses by 3 percentage points, wins the election. That was coming. The point is, big money went about 401 that year. You went to every primary, no challenger won that year. People came out for Trump. When they got there, all they knew was name ID on the congressional candidates.
Look at John Ossoff.
So it actually secured all of those lower races. Yes, but what I'm saying is during the Trump election, there were no congressional upsets going on. No incumbent was losing. I mean, you complain about Congress. Well, it's right.
Everyone's
reelected.
You're right. It's right. the way through. I mean, look, we're going to have to close up there, but the thing that I feel is really important is that in this conversation about draining the swamp, let's get specific about it, and this issue of the money, the political donations, is part of draining the swamp. President Trump spoke about that very powerfully when he was a candidate. He talked about Jeb Bush and Hillary being, you know, the puppets of their donors. I think it's got to be part of his reform agenda now.
And secret money. Again, even the Supreme Court case assumed this was all transparent. The money's being hidden through LLCs, through unverified credit. At least if the voter knows where the money's coming from.
We've got to get it really seriously on the agenda. Anyway, that's all we've got time for right now. You may have never heard of the Export-Import Bank. It's a very good example of what we've been talking about. Next, in tonight's Swamp Watch, you'll learn why it may be one of the most corrupt institutions in D.C. And in the next Revolution First, former Virginia Governor George Allen joins me live to respond to Swamp Watch. You won't want to miss that. Some of the swampiest parts of Washington operate in the dark. Places you never think about, perhaps have never even heard of, are ripe with corrupt behavior precisely because they don't face public scrutiny. Places like the Export-Import Bank.
What is the Export-Import Bank?
The what?
I don't know.
What? I don't know.
Have you heard of it? You should. It's a federal agency dishing out corporate welfare, and it's in the crosshairs of tonight's Swamp Watch. Amazingly, then Senator Barack Obama, as a candidate for president in 2008, explicitly called out the bank's swampy behavior.
The Export-Import Bank that's become little more than a fund for corporate welfare.
Well said, Senator. But then what happened after the election when it was time to reauthorize this swampy institution?
You'll hear some critics suggest that, well, this is just corporate welfare for big multinationals.
Excuse me? Some critics? You were one of them. Wow. Obama got swamped real quick. The Export-Import Bank uses our tax dollars to provide subsidized loans and loan insurance to foreign buyers of American goods. So, for example, if Air India wants to buy planes from Boeing, Ex-Im will loan Air India the money at below-market interest rates. I'm not exactly sure how that counts as exports if American taxpayers are fronting the money for it, but still, the defenders of this bank claim that it exists to support American small businesses. Really? Over 60% of its financing helps just 10 giant corporations like Boeing, Caterpillar, GE and Bechtel, the same giant corporations that spend millions lobbying the politicians in charge of the Export-Import Bank. But it gets worse. Reuters found that as much as $3 billion listed as loans to small businesses was misclassified. Among those categorized as small businesses were a division of billionaire Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway and a subsidiary of Mexican businessman Carlos Slim's global conglomerate. He's one of the richest people on earth. How generous of you, the US taxpayer, to help him out. Last month on Swamp Watch, we exposed the green lobby and companies like Solyndra and Abengoa for their government handouts. Turns out both those swamp things got cash from the Export-Import Bank before they went bankrupt. Solyndra got $10 million in loan guarantees and Abengoa got a $33 million loan from Ex-Im. And which citizen of the swamp was at the center of that? None other than Democratic former governor of New Mexico, Bill Richardson. Richardson sat on both the advisory board of the Ex-Im Bank and the board of Abengoa around the time that one lent taxpayers' money to the other. OK, let's not pretend to be surprised. I mean, any time the federal government doles out money, fraud and corruption are bound to follow. Ex-Im is no exception. In fact, we found at least 85 indictments for fraud, bribery or other wrongdoing involving the Ex-Im Bank. We could spend all night showing you examples of swamp dwellers who got caught stealing our money. But the problems with the bank are even bigger than that. Advocates claim it's okay to put taxpayer dollars on the line because the bank actually makes money for the federal government. Not true. They're loaning out our money at below market interest rates. They're effectively giving it away. The Manhattan Institute found that, quote, Ex-Im Bank's profits are almost surely an accounting illusion. And Forbes wrote, by offering loan guarantees at below market rates, the bank will effectively lose $2 billion over the next decade, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Advocates also claim that this swampy bank protects American manufacturing jobs because their clients couldn't export as much without cheap financing. What? Boeing, GE, Bechtel, these are titans of industry. Why can't they find private lenders to finance their deals at market interest rates, just like all their competitors, not using Ex-Im loans? Export subsidies may boost the profits of the giant corporations who get them, but that doesn't mean they're good for the economy as a whole. In fact, it's bad for the economy because it shifts capital, economic growth and jobs from unsubsidized firms to subsidized ones, also known as politically connected ones. It even hurts some of our own domestic companies. Delta, for example, can't buy Boeing planes with subsidized Ex-Im loans, while foreign airlines like Air India can. That puts Delta at an economic disadvantage with foreign competitors, prompting a legal and lobbying battle between Delta and Boeing over the fate of Ex-Im. In any case, 98% of US exports happen without any involvement of the Export-Import Bank. Hanging on to it is nothing more than big, fat corporations hanging on to their handouts that working Americans pay for. Now, here's the good news. In a bold move, President Trump just nominated former Congressman Scott Garrett to head the Ex-Im Bank. Here's Garrett on the House floor just 2 years ago.
They are resurrecting this fund for corporate welfare. You see, the Export-Import Bank transformed the role of government from a disinterested referee in the economy into a biased actor that uses your taxpayer dollars to tilt the scales in favor of its friends. The proposal before us is the resurrection of a bank that embodies the corruption of the free enterprise system.
Now you're talking. Let's hope he gets in there and shuts down the disgusting corporate welfare. Of course, all the crony capitalists with their snouts in this lucrative trough are lining up to oppose his nomination. But Garrett is right and the cronies are wrong. I'm joined now by a proponent of the bank, former Virginia Republican governor and former Senator George Allen, who wrote an op-ed this week against the selection of Congressman Scott Garrett to head the Export-Import Bank. Thank you so much for joining us. I just want to start by asking you a very simple question. Let's take one of the companies, the big beneficiaries here, Caterpillar. Why is Caterpillar such a useless company that it can't sell stuff internationally without the support of the taxpayer?
Let me just say this, Steve. I was listening closely to all that your presentation here. When I was in the Senate, I had a very similar reaction when I first heard of the Export-Import Bank. When I was governor, we're cutting out state agencies and reducing state spending, and I was looking for any way to reduce federal spending. And I thought, my goodness, the Export-Import Bank, what's the government involved in banking for? I thought it'd be in competition with the private sector. Then I learned more about it and realized it does not compete with the private sector. And in fact, they only make loans if they can't, a customer cannot get private lending. So, for example, you mentioned Caterpillar. If whoever the purchaser is in some other country where we want to export Caterpillar equipment or any other small business manufactured good outside the U.S., we want to get into the markets that 95% of the consumers are outside of the U.S. So if that customer can't get a loan for whatever reason, that's when the Export-Import Bank comes in. And the reality is it does fund itself. There isn't any taxpayer money on it. It runs a profit, a slight profit. You can't say that it... No, it doesn't get any taxpayers' money. It's self-funding. That's the thing. I thought, what are we spending money on? But that's a total... But they make money off of the fees that the customers overseas buy. I don't like Solyndra. I don't like any of this nonsense of renewable energy. I get it. Solyndra was actually bought by some Belgian company, and they paid $300,000 in fees to the Export-Import Bank, and actually paid it back. Unlike the other loans to Solyndra. Money. Right.
You say that there's no taxpayers' money, but that's just not true. The accounting, the CBO says that, and other analyses have shown that actually it makes a loss if it wasn't for these accounting tricks. But I want to move on to a different point.
You can go through accounting, Steve, all you want, but the point is they're in the black no matter which way you do it.
Isn't that quite important?
Yes, it is quite important.
Quite important when we're talking about taxpayers' money to go through the accounting. Look, I want to ask a different question, which is
because you wouldn't want them having a bunch of defaults and the taxpayers being on the hook, and the reality is the default rate is like 0.3 of 1/3 of 1%, much better than commercial lenders.
Boeing say They said a few years ago that they don't need the money. They've got perfectly good alternative sources of credit for their customers, but they take it anyway because it obviously helps their profits. I mean, how can you say that this is not something that is just ripping off the taxpayer?
All right,
companies themselves say they don't need it.
Well, there are companies, and in fact, there's obviously a lot of companies that support the Export-Import Bank, and they're not just big companies. 90% of the transactions go to small companies. In fact, in Virginia, companies like Optical Cable and Roanoke. I'm talking about the transactions, not the dollar amount.
Transactions, of course. No, but
the transactions,
taxpayers' money, we should be interested
out of Roanoke and Bristol Compressors and Orbital Sciences. It's not just all the gigantic companies. And the only time, again, that the Export-Import Bank can do any sort of a loan guarantee is if there are not any financial banks that can
But most
fund
of the money.
So these days, the financial markets are better than they were back in 2008 and 9.
Most of the money goes to big companies, not small ones, and it's those big companies that make the donations to the politicians like yourself who go in there and then get the taxpayers' money rerouted back to the companies who pay them in the first place. Like yourself, you took money from Boeing for your campaigns.
Yes, that's right, and other companies as well. The reality is...
Yes, over 100 from the Export-Import Bank.
Look, who got 100 clients from the Export-Import Bank? What is the allegation here? What are you saying, Steve?
I'm saying that what I'm saying is that your campaign contributions are connected to this argument, because that's how this whole system works, isn't it?
No, here's how it's connected.
Give money to the politicians, and the politicians direct the money to the companies.
Here's how it's connected. It's connected to what President Trump wants, and he wants to see more made in America products and more Americans working. And there's 1.4 million jobs, men and women, who are involved in business, whether they're in South Carolina, Virginia, Washington State, or Illinois, that are manufacturing, good manufacturing jobs. We want to compete on a level playing field. If you get rid of the Export-Import Bank, you say, let's say it's 2%. Well, there's 85 other export credit agencies all around the world. And so if you want to get after Boeing and put people, maybe have a diminished workforce in North Charleston, South Carolina, Washington State, you'll help create more jobs in France because Airbus will get those contracts. Why don't you want American-made products competing with Japan or Germany or the UK or China? Because those countries have export credit agencies. Why shouldn't we be on a level playing field and care about America first?
The level playing field I care about is all the small companies who are disadvantaged by this. And when you're talking about doing what other companies do, we're going to have to go. But I'm going to leave it with what Paul Ryan said in 2015. Paul Ryan, hang on a second.
Businesses are in the supply chain, and they have 90% of the transactions.
Hang on a second. Okay. Paul Ryan said, why should we say me too on crony capitalism? And that is exactly right. Thank you very much for joining us and having that discussion. The panel's been listening, and we're going to get stuck into it next. Good to see you. And we're going to have that coming up next. Don't go away. Okay, we're back with the panel, and I'd love to get their thoughts on what we just heard.
Well, first of all, Steve, I'm glad that you're doing hard-hitting reporting, and thank you for the segment. It's great. Look, what I would just say is what I heard from George Allen is a political execution challenge. You know, this is an issue. You saw it with President Obama in 2008 versus 2015. You know, the reality, and that's what you point out in your reporting, is, you know, once you're in office, things change, and it's easy to say things out of office, and then when you get into office, you know, things change. And so I'll be very excited to see whether or not President Trump can deliver on the promise that he talks so much about on the campaign trail.
Yeah, I mean, this feels to me like a very specific example of fulfilling the drain the swamp agenda, if this guy that he puts in really does clamp down on this.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is a great example of why big government is such a problem. There are so many programs out there. They're spending so much of our taxpayer dollars. It's impossible. I mean, look, this is a complex issue. It's really hard for Americans to understand. In your segment, people had no idea what it was, and it's people want their elected officials to hold this money to account, and they want to feel like their best interests are at their politicians' hearts, and that's unfortunately not what we're getting right now.
Not by a long way.
No.
Yeah, fuzzy accounting, you know, and when he talks about none of these corporations default, well, first of all, they have, Boeing has a market cap of $120 billion. They've got plenty of money to not default on these loans, but they're also going to the government well over and over again. They're government-backed loans. There's going to be more money there because politicians like him keep propping up these corporations. And you're absolutely right. It's the small businesses who suffer. Try being a small business, a business that hasn't existed for more than 5 years, and try getting an SBA loan, let alone something from the Exim Bank. It's almost impossible, and they haven't been at full lending power for the last 2 years, and they should shut it down completely. There are congressmen like Tom McClintock and Justin Amash and Walter Jones and Thomas Massey who are all making a big push to just end the bank straight away.
I agree. Thank you, everyone. Sounds good. But coming up next, we've got a few more surprises for you. We stopped by Politicon to see what's going on at the unconventional political convention. That is coming up next. If you've never heard of it, Politicon is an annual offbeat political convention that brings together people from both sides of the aisle as well as everyone in between. This year's event was right here in Los Angeles, and we went along. Take a look at some of the sights and sounds.
We had an election cycle this year in which we are starting to see an erosion from traditional left, right, center, partisan ideological dynamics.
Bill Clinton, for one, was very attuned to what was happening in the nation and kept kind of sounding the alarm repeatedly.
I don't think American values are necessarily different than any other country, although people try to make that distinction a lot. And what are your values? Besides hard work, yeah, I like to work hard too.
Right, well, so that's another thing that we have in common. We both also like 50 Cent, so there we go. There's another...
I never said I liked 50 Cent, I just had sex with him. The fact that we spend 70% of our gross domestic product on health care, the fact that people go bankrupt paying for health care, like, I understand about having limited government, I understand that argument, but what about human decency with people that cannot afford health care?
And I understand that, but I also don't believe that the universal health care system, I believe that it fails the very people that it's intended to help. And I think that there are examples of that all across the world. I don't think that it's an effective method. It sounds good, but I just don't think that socialism, I don't believe that single-payer universal health care, we can see it.
I don't feel confident in having any of our military be sent on any mission that he's decided they should go on.
But they do. They do.
The politics of the elite no longer spoke for them, and that the Democratic Party had been hijacked. Instead of thinking about our politics as left, right, center, and this sort of spectrum along the middle, it became populist versus elite.
Trump, how do I become famous? Will this help?
Populist versus elite. Yeah, we love that on this show. That's what we're trying to do. Quick final thoughts before we leave tonight. Kennedy.
Final thoughts, Congress, stay where you are. You have not earned your vacation. No s'mores, no campfire. Go back to work. You have utterly failed thus far. Hi.
Jake. Steve, you heard me talk at the beginning about management challenges for Trump, but I think Democrats have big-time branding challenges as well. I reported this week that their new slogan just missed the mark, and they've got a lot of work to do.
Well, I think we can all agree about that. Jessica.
My final thoughts are, if we want change in Washington, citizens are going to have to hold our elected officials accountable. So stay engaged, vote, do everything that you can to hold them to account.
There we are, and then we will have the next revolution. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you at home for joining us, and make sure you tune in next week for the next revolution.